listening to Seniors Junction podcast. We're preventing seniors isolation one conversation at a time. Your hosts today, Dr. Namrata Bagaria, and myself, Dr. Paul Merkley. Our special guest, Professor William Randall of St. Thomas University in Fredericton. Welcome.
Thank you.
So if you would tell us a bit about yourself and what you do, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. I'm a professor of gerontology, as you say, and I've been here at St. Thomas University for 26 years, basically. I started out my career as a Protestant minister, actually, and then I had a conversion experience and went back to university and reinvented myself as an academic, I guess. And I wrote a book called The Stories We Are, an essay on self-creation as my dissertation, which became a book. And that basically has launched me on an interesting career path that brought me to St. Thomas, actually from New Brunswick initially myself. So I came back to New Brunswick, to St. Thomas, and have been here for the last 25, 26 years, teaching gerontology courses to undergraduate students who are preparing themselves for a career with older adults in some capacity. And with a colleague such as Gary Kenyon and others, I've had the opportunity to explore and to develop or to articulate a kind of a unique approach to understanding aging that we call narrative gerontology, which basically starts from the premise that human beings of any age are not just biological or physiological beings, but also, if you will, biographical beings. So we have been looking over the years at the intricate, complex, ever-changing inside aspects of the aging process, and not simply focusing on problems, shall we say, that I think gerontology in general tends to kind of focus on, and that's all well and good. But there's a lot of sort of dimensions of aging that go on the inside that have to do with the way we make meaning, the way we change in terms of our understanding of ourselves, our personality, our feelings. And that opens up a space where we can talk about things like wisdom, I think, and spirituality in later life, which is kind of a more positive way of thinking about what aging can be. That kind of gives you a sense, I hope, in a nutshell, of my where I'm at.
No, that's beautiful. I think personally also I have used a lot of narrative. So there's a movement around rewriting your narrative. So I've worked a lot on myself and on those topics. And I did a lot of volunteer work around that. So I enjoy that topic immensely. And my question to you is, so if you've worked a lot with older adults and training students in that subject, you must have come across isolation, senior isolation as a topic. And what is your take on senior isolation? What are the pain points?
Absolutely. In my previous career, a lot of my parishioners were older adults, and it was my task to visit them in their homes or apartments and get to know them. And many of them did live alone. And I found, and I like your motto, one conversation at a time, I found that my role was to have conversations with them in which I asked them to tell me about their lives. And sometimes I would visit in the afternoon, which probably was not a very smart thing on my part, because after lunch I tend to get sleepy. That's the way I'm wired. But when I would knock on the door of Mrs. Smith or Mr. Jones or whatever, and we would start to get into a conversation about their life, I would wake up, I would get energized, and I found invariably that they would as well. And what started out to be kind of a sleepy start of a conversation, by a half hour or an hour, we were both kind of buzzing with energy. So that fueled my sense, Nam, that there's something potentially healing and energizing in a positive way about giving people, particularly isolated folks like older adults can be, an opportunity to talk about their lives. Because one of the main pain points from my perspective in later life is that there can be fewer and fewer people who take the time to sit with us or to talk with us and to ask us about the world and about life as we see it. I heard a troubling statistic once, I'm not sure if it's true, that research suggests that in the average nursing home in, say, North America, individual residents can receive sometimes no more than about 6 minutes per day of meaningful contact with other residents, staff, etc. Because these are very busy places, and they're oriented often towards making sure that people are comfortable and well fed. But if that's true, that there's that kind of statistic, that is quite troubling. My mother is currently a resident in a special care home. She's 99. And I notice a lot of the people that live in that same facility are often by themselves. It's not a nursing home per se, but they spend a lot of time by themselves. I do need to plug a little bit, this is getting ahead of myself, that my mom has figured out her own way of combating social isolation. She has macular degeneration, so she can't see very well at all, but she can see just well enough to make out the numbers on the keypad of her phone. And when she goes to bed at night, they get her to bed around 7 o'clock, that's her favorite time, she gets on the phone and she has a total of more than 120, I think, people in her social circle. Most of them are younger than her because she's outlived everybody, that she starts calling. Not that many per night, but on average 10, 15, even 20 per night. She'll call, she'll check in. Obviously she's cognitively very sharp and very alert for her age. But she will check in with these folks. How are you doing? How did that test result come back? Is your daughter going to be home for Christmas? And the conversation might last only 5 minutes or so, but mother the next morning will inevitably say, well, I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And often she will dial these numbers from memory. Even if she had them written down, she probably couldn't read the numbers themselves on the paper. So that is one particular individual's way of proactively combating what could be social isolation. But generally speaking, and COVID only exacerbates this in my view. A lot of older adults, particularly after they've been widowed or widowered or have been confined to some sort of an institutional setting, can be further and further alone. And I have, with my colleagues, coined a term that points to one of the unique challenges that come with later life from a narrative perspective. I call them narrative challenges. And one of my colleagues has coined the phrase narrative loneliness, which is loneliness, but it's loneliness in the sense of for an individual who has few opportunities to talk about themselves, talk about what their story is, because our stories, in my view, are integral to our sense of identity. And there's a whole dimension of narrative psychology that supports the link, the strong link between the stories that we have about our lives and our sense of personhood, identity, agency, and so forth. So when an older person has fewer and fewer people left who actually know their story, or at least have a version of their story that's familiar, the older adult, him or herself, feels increasingly, well, isolated. So this idea of one conversation at a time combating social isolation is bang on, in my view, as far as a narrative gerontology view of the world is.
Thank you. And, you're mentioning this, and for me, my father recently passed away 7 months ago, and he was in the last 2 months in the ICU. So the first, he was in Mumbai in the ICU, where everybody knew him, right? Because he was their patient for a long time, and he was also friends with the doctor. So he was very comfortable, but then we had to have advanced treatments. So we had to take him another city, another hospital. And in the beginning, he was like, he didn't know anybody, right? And at one day I get a call like, he's not cooperating, can you come? And my thing was, okay, listen, you guys, you just know his chart, you don't know him. So here's what I'm going to tell you about him. And I said, you're going to pretend that you know his story, and you're going to tell him, Mr. Bagaria, I Googled you and I found this about you, and da 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 da. And he did that. And from that day, my dad became cooperative. So what you said is true. Like, he was advanced stage lung disease. He was in a transplant unit. He had a lot of procedures, a lot of tubes, so he couldn't speak towards the end of his life, right? He couldn't speak, he could write. We had only 20 minutes screen time, 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening, where he could only put up the papers that he had. We sent a book so he could still write. He was a lawyer, so very sharp cognitively, like you said. He couldn't dial numbers because his voice, right? He was a tracheostomy, right? So what you're saying, as you were saying, I could remember my dad and all those flashes of uh, memories which were not that far for me. But it is true that even the most brilliant treatments in the hospital, the best transplant units, the best of best, in the end, in the end, the hospital was like, "Can we hire you to motivate other patients?" And I laughed, and I was like, "You know what? Maybe." And my thesis is motivation for physical activity for older adults, but then you can cross apply that in other domains. But personally, like this narrative piece, like we've done I used to do something called Soulful Saturdays, which is every Saturday conduct like a topic, let's say self-esteem, self-worth, whatever, and have people come and talk. And so that was for the whole COVID. I did that to support the Ottawa community. I did that as a volunteer. I started it myself because I live by myself, and as a international immigrant to Canada, there's a high risk of being isolated. So I started that, and now we are cross applying that in Seniors Junction, and we call it
Wow.
Senior Circles. So what you said is so inspiring and bang on, and we didn't know what it is. Like, we knew, like, we had a physician friend tell us, right, Paul, that if you go to a long-term care, all you see is pictures and stories, and please make sure you include that in your business model. And I was like, okay, sure, why not? And then in my head, I was like, how do you monetize this? Because if you're saying a business model, so then we made it like a PR activity, but we made it an activity which is true, where there's privacy and all that is maintained. But so yeah, this is our experience with narrative. And sorry, Paul, I'm eating in your speaking time.
No, I
Oh,
wanted
good.
to
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
I wanted to build on what you've just said, Nam, because one of the concepts that some of us work with in this whole narrative gerontology thing. By the way, narrative gerontology has nice links with narrative psychology on the one hand,
Mhm,
and narrative medicine on the other. And happily, these are quite vibrant and growing sort of areas of inquiry, research, and practice. And
mhm,
that bodes well for narrative gerontology going forward. But one of the concepts that I like to use is narrative environment.
mhm.
Basically, it means that we don't story our lives in isolation, but
Exactly.
typically from childhood on within families, and families are not just physical and social environments, but they're also narrative environments. Um, Now, when you get to be of a certain age and you need to go into a hospital, um, going into a hospital is a radical shift in the narrative environment that you're living and breathing in. If you go from your apartment in an ambulance to an emergency room, it's a very different narrative environment. There's different rules, shall we say, for who says what to whom in what ways, and shall we say, logical thought trumps narrative thought. There's a whole line of thinking that shows that we human beings are wired to think narratively as well as logically, but narrative thinking is the way in which we make sense of our lives and construe and change our identity. So the potential for an older adult to become, as I would say, de-storied, which is a play on words, when they go into and have to stay in a hospital ward with, obviously needing to be there for their physical health. The situation that you described initially with your dad is a reality. So you have wonderfully and brilliantly sort of helped that part of that hospital to realize that we need to open up our narrative environment to be more inviting of the stories of our patients, so that they're not non-compliant or cranky or withdrawn, but rather feeling engaged and part of their own healing process.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and we did interview a company which has this whole line that the Toronto-based company, and they just do empathy. So they do story building. So between the 6 minutes that you mentioned, exactly when the care provider is going from one room to the other, the nurse or whatever, they get the story of that person, so they are quite aware, so they can talk.
Yes.
So they're using technology to build empathy. We interviewed them on a podcast. If you want, I can connect you guys later on.
I'd like to know about that. The thing about narrative care, which is another term that some of us are using more and more, and I think narrative care is every bit as important as pharmacare and dietary care and so forth. But narrative care, as I like to say to students and people I talk to, it's not rocket science. That doesn't mean that it's simple or easy, because becoming a better story listener is an art in itself. And I have a good colleague of mine that you may have heard of. I can direct you to him. If not, you might be a wonderful person to interview sometime. His name is Robert Mundle, and he is I'm not sure of his exact title, but he works in the field of palliative care, where many of the patients, of course, are older adults, not all, but many, in the Kingston area, in connection with Queen's University. And he's written a wonderful book called How to Become an Even Better Listener. And it's geared towards helping people who are volunteers in, say, hospice or palliative units and so forth. And it's a wonderfully written book that that stresses the complex, subtle art of listening carefully to someone's story in a way that invites them to open up and to feel more themselves, or to discover possibilities for change. There's a wonderful book that comes out of the narrative therapy community. A couple of I think Australian narrative therapists who work with Aboriginal peoples. The title of the book is Telling Our Stories in Ways That Make Us Stronger. And I love that title and that idea that by listening in such a way that we invite someone to tell their story, even if we just got 6 minutes worth of time to invite them, can I think increase a person's inner strength in just wonderful ways. Again, not rocket science. It's as old as the hills, but it's I think we have maybe lost touch with the importance of that kind of story listening as a key component of narrative care with older adults. And I think whether it's older adults who are in institutions or who are living isolated lives in high-rise apartments, any opportunity such as these storytelling circles that you alluded to can be a fantastic way to, because there's a lot of what I call narrative work that we have to do as we get older. We talk about developmental tasks early in life, like learning how to go to the bathroom and tie your shoes and talk and walk and so forth. But as we get older, there are still developmental tasks. I call them narrative tasks. And that involves, among other things, engaging in what Erik Erikson called life review. Again, not an easy thing to do. And sometimes we need a skillful listener to assist us in that process. And that kind of engagement in life review is a way of, shall we say, pulling ourselves together internally or narratively. And that I believe can contribute to aging in a positive or creative and soulful kind of way. And if we don't allow people the chance to engage in that narrative, those narrative tasks, then we're doing them a disservice, I fear.
Thank you.
All right, I tend to wander, and when I
No, that's
No, it's always right on point. It's wonderful. I especially appreciate some of the things you're saying about tying narrative to identity. It's very interesting. You've spoken a lot about your vision for addressing seniors' isolation. Is there anything you would like to add about that?
Oh, so many things I would like to add. I'm working with some colleagues revising a book manuscript, which we have entitled tentatively, Things That Matter, a narrative inquiry into the role of special objects in the stories of our lives. And tying in with what Nam was saying earlier, this is actually a strategy that I would use when I was a minister on those otherwise sleepy afternoons and when I was visiting people. If I saw a particular memento on the mantelpiece of Mrs. Smith's house as she went to the kitchen to make the tea, then I thought, okay, there's something that maybe there's a story perhaps behind that memento or that picture or that painting or whatever it might, that piece of furniture. So when she came back with the tea tray and the biscuits, I would say, so Mrs. Smith, I'm just curious, is that your husband in the picture? Yes, that's my husband, Robert. And he's been gone we had some wonderful times. Those kinds of simple questions can open up the floodgates often. So paying attention to the things that are important to people's lives can be really important, because there's typically stories, complex layered stories very often we're finding in our research. I'll give you an example. One of the participants in the study that we're writing up as a book was being interviewed about her experience of going through some life writing workshops that we had deliberately designed. And the student who was interviewing her noticed that she made reference to something that was kind of important to this woman, and that was a torn page from an Italian language textbook. And the story is that torn page from an Italian language textbook is one that she kept because it relates to when she was a little girl. She was passionate about playing the violin. Her brother was passionate about studying mathematics or whatever. And one day when she was screeching on the violin, and her brother was trying to concentrate, he jokingly said to his mother, who was in the other room, because he was reading a particular page of his, he was actually studying Italian on that particular afternoon. And the page was a picture of a little girl playing the violin on the page. And the text was, deliver us from people who can't play the violin and make screeching noise, or something like that in Italian. Well, the mother misunderstood that this woman's brother was just kind of making a joke. And the mother forbade this little girl to ever after play the violin because the brother's, education was, in the mother's view, more important than her daughter's, trying to play a violin. She probably would never be very good. Anyway, so for years, this woman carried around with her what's been referred to in the research literature as a possible self of the violinist that wasn't. And she told stories about going to concerts and breaking out into tears when she heard the violinist playing, because she thought, oh, I could have been a violinist, and so forth. So this simple little object that she'd held on to held all kinds of stories, sometimes, with a sad and negative twinge to them, that revealed a lot about her identity. This woman had gone on to do some wonderful things and had worked those issues through. But the significance of that little torn piece of paper from a textbook, forms a very interesting chapter in our book itself. But I mention that because that's one of many avenues. I call them avenues into people's story worlds. Not only what they tell us, but what they don't tell us. The shadow stories that are sort of between the lines, and the things that are obviously important for them. In many institutions, I think this is a good thing, residents will have shadow boxes outside the room, and those shadow boxes might have some photographs, might have some medals from the war, etc. And if you can quickly have a look at what's in that window box or shadow box before you walk into Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones' room, then you have, at a glance, a quick sense of what their story might be. And it can probably trigger some questions that you could ask to kind of start the juices flowing, start the stories flowing, and make a connection that will, I think, inevitably, not always, but to have a positive impact upon that person's sense of identity, sense of well-being, sense of meaning and purpose. And hey, somebody noticed me.
Thank you.
This is
That's
beautiful.
great.
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, I can say like so many points and go on, but I will control myself and keep it a few points. I think the first point is about the story. A lot of the modern social media, in quotes, even though you talk about modern, but what is it? It's your dating profiles, about stories. When you're meeting somebody, it's all about somebody has to listen in. Or if you are in social media, you have profile, can you write about on LinkedIn, on Facebook, wherever, right? It's a little bit about you. Even on Clubhouse, there's a bio, and that's the most important part. So a lot of the social media, just that the things are digital, but the concepts are the same. Scrapbook are stories and
Mm,
memories and stuff
mm,
like that. So it's still the same.
mm,
And for me, I don't know, the two things. One is I want to thank Paul. So I learned a lot of narrative and rechanging narrative, but something he taught me was also images.
mm,
Like we carry broken mental images, and he taught me this method. And the way I use it now, because when you're becoming a high performer in life, like I work very hard on myself, and not just my work, but I have to work hard on myself every morning. Go through your mental
mm,
laundry list and see what's holding you back. So apart from this broken narrative, or rewriting your story kind of a thing, is also this fixing images, because you have these broken images, and that is which is that method, Paul, Virginia Satir method that you taught me.
Yes, it's a Virginia Satir people making method.
mm, mm,
Yes, so that's something we use on a daily basis, even for company, even for ourselves, and of course narrative. And I
mm,
think the other part of what you were talking with narrative, which I think, I don't know if it's true for you, Bill, and for Paul,
mm,
but I've started telling people, okay, I get what you're saying, but I haven't understood your why. So nowadays, I try to understand people's why. What is this person's why? And
mm,
once you've understood the why, because that's what you do, then you can do the how. Like it doesn't matter. So but if the whys don't match, if there's no value alignment, those
mm,
businesses or those associations or those friendships or those whatever
mm,
don't won't stand the test of time.
mm,
So for me, when I'm listening, I also have this internal analytics going on to understand somebody's why.
mm,
Because behind all the pity story and behind or the bravado story or whatever, behind the stories, there is
mm,
an underlying sentiment, and there's an
mhm.
underlying identity,
Yeah.
which is with
Yes.
that why. So I
Yeah.
think of late, I remember I met somebody and I speak a lot to that person, and I'm like, you know what, I get a lot of you, but I don't understand your why yet.
Mm,
And the person's like, what do you mean? I said, I think a lot of you is not you. It is a perception of you, but which you also are not aware, because the why is usually very easy to reach, and for many people the layers are so many,
mm,
it's harder to reach. So I've seen, like, in many people who have a stronger layer, the narrative therapy takes a lot of time because you have so much to work with.
mm.
There's so much of external, like say so much of cutting through the crap in quotes. You have to cut to
Uh,
the chase and find that core, and that's where you can really work interventions with that person, whether it's behavior change, whether it's technology, onboarding, whatever that is. uh,
you remind me, Nam, of a comment that a student of mine made once. I teach a course every year and have for 25 years called Narrative Gerontology. It's my baby, I guess you could say. But one student, as we were looking at the complex links between narrative and identity, and Paul underscored that earlier, there's nothing simple about a life story, the student wrote in her learning journal. And there are layers that, as you're suggesting, there's the what, but then there's the why. There's oftentimes a story or many stories. In fact, underneath there's um, another quote that I am drawn to is by the autobiography scholar Paul John Eakin, who writes in one place, there are many stories of self to tell and many selves to tell them. So I think from a narrative perspective, we are as infinitely complex and layered as our bodies are. All the different bodily systems that intertwine, to keep us alive. The same is true with, in terms of our biographical, the biographical side or autobiographical side of our lives. And it's that going down multiple rabbit holes about concerning that narrative complexity of everybody's life, regardless of how old we are, that has kept me curious and excited, as you can sense, for quite a number of years. So thank you, both of you, for resonating, I guess, with these ideas. And
Thank
there's
you.
just so many things going on these days. There are narrative matters conferences that we here at St. Thomas started back in 2002. They happen every 2 years. There are journals, and many different disciplines are feeling the impact of the so-called narrative turn. Medicine, obviously, psychology, obviously, gerontology now too.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on that focusing on this age-old dimension of human beings as storytelling creatures. We've always been that way. That's what separates us, I think, from squirrels and birds and
Yeah.
slugs and so
Yeah.
forth. Yeah.
You know, I read this book called Breathe, Believe, Balance by Shamal Vallabhji. So he's a performance coach. And what you did last sentence, which you said, they said, we are not social creatures, we are story creatures.
Mm.
So we want to always hold on to a story. And Paul knows that after I read the book, my productivity, like if it was X, it was like 20X now, because it was just a lot of, and it was not that long back, what, a few weeks back, because I had gone through this so much. You know, when there is a death of a family member, you're made to choose a lot of decisions which you thought you could at some point take it later on, but you have to, right? I'm middle of a pandemic in my country, you need to get back to Canada, so many decisions to be made. And so what you do is you shed off like a snake a lot of the skin that you have. That's what I would say, like a snake, you know, because that's what I was literally doing is, okay, is this any more useful? Is that non-useful? No, okay, throw it aside. Is this useful? Throw it aside. What is left? And so the more I'm aligned with my why, the more I feel I'm aligned with purpose. And the more I'm aligned with my purpose, the more I'm meeting for people on the same path. The manifestation of life has become so easy. So some way,
Synchronicities.
pardon me?
Synchronicities occur.
Yes. So it's not some magic or not some voodoo or some, you know, the secret, it's not so secret, you know, because if you're clear inside, you're going to be clear outside. There is nothing in and out which is different. And now if someone asks me that, I would truly say that. But had I been like, especially when you're doing a PhD, you go through so much of self-doubt, and it's such a horrible phase of life to be in. And to keep mental sanity, you need to keep, you know, looking at, okay, what am I doing? And okay, this is not needed. Let's throw this aside. So for me, I feel doing a startup and this whole immigration and all these things, suddenly you realize I cannot have so much story. And Paul talks about lightness and velocity, you know, and Paul, you can tell something about that. And that comes with narrative therapy. It's about shedding away all those stories which don't make sense anymore and keeping what makes sense and then guzzling forward, like, you know, marching forward with that. Paul, what is that lightness and velocity thing where did you pick it up from?
I think it was a combination of places. I think it was a little bit of Gadamer, Truth and Method, and a little bit of different metaphysical readings. I think so.
Yeah.
What you say is very compelling. I just wanted to say fast, I sent some of my students to interview the children and grandchildren of conductors of silent film orchestras. And one of the people they interviewed was in a nursing home. And he was very interested in talking to them, kept them there for 3 hours. And they left, and he told them all about what his parents' day was like, and when his mother played the relief piano and when his father conducted the orchestra. Told them all this stuff. And as it happened, he was a reserve captain, and my student was an officer in the reserve too, in the military. And then the day after they went, they were notified that the gentleman had just died. And they kind of felt a little guilty and badly because, you know, on his second last day, they had taken 3 hours of his time. And I said, but no, look at it another way. I said, if that's how I was going to, if that was my time, and on the second last day, young people came and they were terribly interested in my story, that would be a very nice way to transition to the next place. I don't know.
Yes, because one of the dimensions of the aging process is what's been called generativity, and you know, for the very elderly, an opportunity to share with a younger person the life lessons and the stories that have been part of their identity is it's what's been called generative transference or generative narration, and it's a way leaving one's legacy and knowing that that you've contributed in some small way to the enriching of younger people's lives and minds and hearts. And what a way to go. If I were that guy, I would be saying he probably died of a happy heart attack. If that's, sorry, I don't mean to be crude or whatever, but
Yes, I think so too.
Yeah.
I think so
Yeah.
too.
And Bill, what do you think would be the opportunities and challenge if we want this vision that we have better listeners and volunteers or caregivers be more acutely aware of the stories that are there? What are the opportunities and challenges in this? Because this is not something they're taught, or it's very prescriptive. It's very like authoritarian. So how do you build that in a system?
well, one of the things that 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 can be done, and I get the chance to do this every year for the last 2 or 3 years. I've had a chance to speak to for 3 hours to first-year nursing students at the University of New Brunswick about what I see to be the core concepts of narrative gerontology and narrative care as they go forward to become nurses, whether they work with older adults or not. Because everybody's got a story. If you're 20 or 200, everybody's got a story. So that's one thing that yes is important, is to somehow or other embed an appreciation for the importance of people's stories to their sense of identity and meaning and purpose into the curricula of as many caring professions as we possibly can. With Zoom, I mean, it's easier actually to do that now than with COVID, and therefore resorting to things like Zoom. It's easier to inject those elements into a curriculum from a distance than maybe it would have been in the past. So the other thing I would say is there's, in my view, of course, I've been involved in this narrative thing for a number of years, and as I mentioned earlier, some of us here at our university started a series of conferences that happen every 2 years called Narrative Matters, and they bring together researchers, theorists, and practitioners from multiple disciplines, including literary theory, including philosophy, including musicology, but also social work, education, medicine, nursing, etc., and therapy, to explore and to honor the narrative complexity of human life on every level. And I'm happy to report that those conferences have been going on now for, well, 20 years. COVID kind of threw things off a bit. The one in 2020 was supposed to have happened in Atlanta, but now it's been rescheduled till next spring. And then the one after that's going to be taking place in Finland. There's been a couple in Paris, France, one in the Netherlands, others in Canada. So being alert to narrative thinking that's going on in multiple disciplines is one thing that I think can contribute to a deepened appreciation for the importance of stories and story listening. Mm-hmm. There are some journals, actually. The journals that deal with narrative ideas tend to be within the field of psychology, although we here at STU launched some years ago an online peer-reviewed journal called Narrative Works. And it's a kind of a play on words in the title there. And we are now passing that journal, because I'm retiring, and so is my colleague who co-edits it with me. We're passing it on to some colleagues at the university, Miami University in Ohio. So there are journals, in other words, and not just journals that have the word narrative in the title, that I stumble upon all the time, that are appreciating and making use of narrative ideas to better understand how human beings tick, how societies tick, how cultures tick, and communities tick. I don't want to leave the impression that narrative is just all a happy, slappy, wonderful kind of thing, because there are dark narratives out there. There are people can be in the grips of some very dysfunctional stories. Yes. About themselves and about the world. And so the need for positive restoring is always there.
Yes. Yes.
So I don't know if that, I mean, I hope we can continue having conversations of this sort, because it's fun for me and exciting for me to know that that there's a receptivity to these ideas that, as you say, I've been kind of playing with and writing about for 30 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
narrative. My colleague Gary Kenyon and I, we often talk about, because we've written a couple of books together, we often talk about the importance of taking narrative gerontology to the streets. Because that one conversation at a time, you can make a very important and positive difference in one older adult's life simply by stopping and saying, so tell me a little bit about yourself. That's not a question that normally people get asked in the run of a day or a week or a month or a year, or even a lifetime. So when you or I ask that kind of question and are genuine in asking it, there can be a positive shift often in that person's energy. Wow, do you really want to know? Yes. Because sometimes people say, well, I was born in Ottawa and grew up and went to college and here I am. And they kind of give a very short version because they figure that's all that their listener will tolerate. But if you as a listener say, well, can you tell me more? That just sounds so intriguing. You can feel that person sort of, well, I remember the time when growing up on the farm, blah, blah, blah. And before you know it, oftentimes on these visits I would have with people in those sleepy afternoons, by the time an hour had passed, both of us were just kind of buzzing with energy. And Mrs. Smith or Mr. Jones would often shake my hand vigorously, thank you so much. And I figured, what did they do? I just drank some of your coffee, your tea, and ate some of your biscuits. But what they were saying was, you kind of gave me back my life.
I'm just getting so excited talking to you. We should invite him for senior circle, Paul.
Yes, yes, yes.
This is exactly
That's
the
a
feeling.
really good idea. That's a very good
It was so funny. We did the one on Father's Day, and yes, I am the host, and but I actually felt so happy, and I called Paul after that. I'm like, listen, I said so many things about my father I would have never spoken. All good, but it gave me a release. Though I'm here with my family in India right now, and what I mean is, it was just fantastic. It was like some 8 of us, and all of us shared story. And yes, the farm comes up a lot, and Paul laughs because I have been to a farm like 2 or 3 times. I grew up in a city. So I have no idea when they talk, but I do understand. Like, I didn't know what lumberjacks were. I didn't know so many stuff. So I'm always referencing and learning about Canada and how people grew up. So different from Mumbai. So yes.
Not many farms in the middle of Mumbai.
Just
No.
not. So, but what you're saying is true, because it is because of this. Like, I trained in qualitative research, so I, of course, not very strong yet. As a researcher, I'm young in my career, I would say. But what I realized quickly in public health, because that's what I work, right? So you want to do interventions, you need to know people's stories. And so for me, it was as a result of my work, I started becoming like, you want people to adopt technology, you want them to, take contraception, like whatever, you have to make it relatable and be relatable. So that whole concept of relatedness, which is a basic human need, right? Autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And then Paul and I talk a lot about connected autonomy, and that's where your narrative therapy would come under. And we've written a chapter on that. So not narrative therapy, but something around that. So
I'd like to have a copy of that if I may.
sure, absolutely. So yes, so the chapter is around ikigai, and how ikigai and connected autonomy is what will help with isolation. And the way the Japanese have done it with ikigai and onai and all those concepts, right? So we are trying with our startup to translate some of that Eastern wisdom into a Western context. And the closest, without putting a religious tinge to it, is music. So here is a professor of music, and the second was storytelling, and that is you. So it's like I am right now in basically heaven, because the future, if I take technology, which is where I work, is training new, AI, which is, say, NLP, natural language programming. If you put the logics that you have, if you know that this is the data, like say you can talk to Alexa, you can talk to a pet robot. I don't want seniors to only talk to robots, but I'm just giving an example. That, and if you can process that information, with the frameworks that you presented, or play the playlists, like, when they're talking, and then the emote based on their affect, a Renaissance chanson motet, something comes out, you are making a difference. So for me right now, this is gold, like talking to two people in storytelling and music, because technology by itself will not solve anything. It needs the context, it needs the why, it needs for whom and how. And this kind of things, if we pull it together, and this interdisciplinarity is where the magic lies. So for me, this is like absolutely gold. And
You,
I
you,
think
you,
you've
you
answered the
need to
question. Sorry.
you need to come to the Maritimes, Nam,
I'm
and Paul
more than
back again, because I think one of the things that's been traditional in maritime life is singing and playing music and telling stories around the kitchen table, kitchen parties, so to speak. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm proud to be living in this part of the world. I'll send you a little chapter that I wrote called Strengthening Our Stories, Narrative Resilience Through Narrative Care, where I make reference to a number of narrative interventions that have been used in different parts of the world with older adults. And that might be
sure.
a valuable resource in your collection as you send your article to me.
Sure, I will. I will. So that article, Paul has finished it. It's me who has to finish it. So by the time this podcast is released, I'm sure it's done, because we have a few days that we record ahead. But yeah, sure. Like, why am I smiling so much is because this is the thing, right? We started this podcast thinking, okay, you know what? We're just going to start talking to people. We don't know what will come out of it.
Mm,
And it became like, okay, one person said yes, the next person said yes, and the next person said yes, and then suddenly we had so many stories of other people,
mm.
right? So we'd suddenly understand isolation better, and then we apply it from time to time. But Paul, what do you think? This is fantastic.
I think the richness of this conversation is just wonderful.
We don't want to stop recording.
But we don't want to stop recording. Can I ask the question that I'd like to ask, just to make sure it's asked for uniformity? What advice would you have for us as a company and as people interested in doing something about seniors isolation?
Advice, my goodness, far be it from me to give advice, but I could say, keep on doing what you're doing. I'm so excited to hear what you are embarking on. I love this motto that you quoted about making a difference one conversation at a time, because I think the value of simple, ordinary, plain old conversation, particularly where we're deeply listening to someone else share about their life, that just is so, I call it therapoetic. And the ripple effects
Yeah.
in that individual's life are incredible, because I mean, this is one of the things about Zoom, if I may say so, that I actually quite like, and I'm grateful to COVID that we're doing a lot of Zooming, is because I think we can have equally intimate, maybe in some cases even more intimate exchanges with one another through this platform, through this medium. I've certainly experienced that a lot with students and with colleagues. Earlier this year, we had a group that somebody that I know in Frederick started up, and every month we would meet for about an hour and a half to talk about a book that we'd all read in common. It happened to be a book that I'd written called "In Our Stories Lies Our Strength." But there were people on the Zoom call from Quebec, from the Gaspé Peninsula, from different parts of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and we developed a nice little community, I must say, and I kind of missed that. The other thing I would say would be keep on networking, which is what you're doing through these podcasts. And I learned about the work that Robert Mundle and his colleagues are doing through the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. The word spiritual might be an off-putting word, but they're basically about listening to people's stories, and in that way helping people deal with end-of-life issues and so forth. But there's a whole network of folks there that are doing similar kinds of things, or wanting to do similar sorts of things as I think are motivating you. So networking with various organizations and various clusters of people. There's the whole narrative therapy network that may that could benefit from having more focus on seniors and seniors issues, or older adults and older adults issues. And my mind is just kind of going over time. We're in the process of for the Narrative Matters 2022 conference in Atlanta, we're in the process of preparing a virtual map of the narrative world. In other words, the various institutes and centers and university departments and networks that are doing narrative, these sorts of things, plugging into that kind of world can be another way of, and here's, something else that brings me back to Ottawa itself. A few years ago, I was interviewed as part of a CBC Ideas episode called Aging by the Book. I think it was aired initially in February of 2013. It's on my website. Anyway, it was conducted by a Wendy Robbins, who, along with her colleague, the name is eluding me right now. This is embarrassing. Anyway, through the Ottawa Public Library, there has been running for some years, apparently, a discussion group involving older adults who come together to read works of poetry, short stories, essays, and then talk about what those texts say to them about the aging process and their own aging experience. And it's, I don't know if they're still able to meet virtually, but I have in my shelf here somewhere, I have the guidebook, the manual that they've developed as to how to have similar kinds of discussion groups in your own community, whether it's through a church or a mosque or a seniors center or whatever it might be. And my sense is that these kinds of discussions among older adults, particularly baby boomers who have perhaps particular energy and curiosity, is really mushrooming all around us. And maybe Zoom and COVID have helped that happen rather than hinder it. You know, it's my perspective. We have a local group of older adults here who have been meeting for the last 4 years, once a month, and they call themselves Writing Our Life Stories, or WOLS for short. The founder of that group, Vivian Edwards, came to a workshop that I did on reading and writing our lives some years ago. She called me up afterwards, said, could I meet you for coffee at Tim Hortons? Because I think I'd like to start an ongoing group like that, to bring older adults together to write stories about their lives, not in a creative writing kind of way where you're critiquing each other's work, but in a more open-hearted kind of way where the members come together, they write stories about some aspect of their life, and then some of them share out loud or read out loud the story that they have written. Not to have them critiqued, but to have them applauded and celebrated. And that group's been going for 4 years, and they've developed a community, and they have an energy. I've met with them here recently. They had a kind of a summer end of year kind of party outdoors, and they were all just, we love this. We love writing about our stories. It helps us, pass on our lives to our kids and our grandkids, but it's also for us too. And I think they're finding this is an opportunity for them as they write about their lives and then talk about their stories to the others, to tackle some of those narrative tasks that I alluded to earlier, and to deal with some of those narrative challenges, including narrative loneliness and also narrative foreclosure, which I could talk about for another half hour. But
yeah, no, this is great because you kept saying community, and in the initial tagline for the company was community connections conversations. So this was the tagline: Seniors Junctions, Community Connection Conversations. And we keep thinking, should we keep it? Should we not? Should we upgrade it? Not. So like clearly it was like, it was in the beginning, way in the beginning, you just think of it and we put it, and then over time, and then when you're getting so much of feedback. And we also offer courses. So the way we monetize the startup, because we have to maintain the sustainability of an initiative, we don't want it to die away. So we have courses we offer. And so I think we can, after this podcast, talk about offering a story writing course like you've mentioned, because we have a whole spectrum of courses, and I will share with you what we do. And I think this would be a great addition, because we talk about serious leisure, and writing is a serious leisure, and this is not something that can happen in 1 time, 2 times. So it's an 8-week course. And so we talk about that. But before I wrap up this podcast, could you tell us about your coordinates and how can people find you?
Right. Well, people can email me at B Randall or Brandall, Brandall at stu.ca, or they can visit my website, which is www.williamlrandall, all one word, lowercase.com. I'm happy to chat with people, and hopefully we can chat again, because
Sure.
these conversations are energizing, exciting, and full of discovery and learning.
Exactly. So thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Take care.
Thank you.